What if your dream lakeside retreat turned into a battlefield against the ultimate entitled invader, one who thinks memories trump deeds, and tantrums outrank the law? Buckle up for a tale of poetic justice where fences aren't just barriers, but masterpieces of karma. The sound of tires spinning in gravel served as my initial alert that peace had been shattered at the lake that morning. And when I glanced up from my coffee, I spotted a teenage boy I'd never encountered climbing out of a Jeep, slamming the door as if it owed him rent, and storming straight up to my front gate like he was there to collect a package from Amazon, not barge into a man's life with the entitlement of a billionaire's dog walker. Before I could utter a single word, he barked out. My mom said I could use the cabin this weekend for my birthday party, so unlock the gate, man. We're setting up the DJ booth right here. That sentence alone almost made me drop my mug. I stood there blinking, wondering what alternate universe this kid crawled out of where people just show up and claim cabins like they're calling shotgun in a car. I told him I didn't know who his mom was and that this was my property, which should have ended the story, but instead it was the spark that lit the powder keg. He rolled his eyes like I was the one being unreasonable and then casually muttered, "Dude, you don't want to make my mom drive down here. She'll be pissed. She said, this place used to be ours and she's taking it back one way or another." I stared at him for a long beat, then turned and walked inside to grab my phone because if I was about to be invaded by a full-blown Karen infestation, I needed to alert the sheriff before the vines wrapped around the porch and strangled the bird feeder. By the time I came back outside, her SUV was already kicking up dust on the dirt road like a bull charging a red flag. And when it parked, half on my driveway and half on a strip of grass that absolutely was not public, Karen herself emerged in full theatrical glory, oversized sunglasses, a leopard scarf, and an expression like the world was a dinner party that kept forgetting to serve her. "Excuse me," she called out, stepping forward like a queen on a parade float. "But this is a family property, and my son will be having his birthday here as planned. You're welcome to leave quietly or I'll have to get legal." I let out a slow exhale and said, "Ma'am, I bought this land 3 years ago at auction. I have the deed, the survey, and the permit to build this gate you're leaning on. Your name isn't on any of it." She gave a cold, clipped laugh, the kind you hear from sitcom villains when the laugh track forgets to join in. And she launched into a monologue about how this cabin was part of her emotional inheritance from her ex-husband's side, and how her son always celebrated birthdays here, and how it was cruel and unethical for me to just exist here like a stranger. I wanted to respond with logic, but you can't use a map to reason with a tornado. So instead, I calmly walked over, locked the gate, pocketed the key, and said, "Well, if you think this is your land, you're free to file a claim. Until then, I'm calling the sheriff to make sure things don't get messier than they already are." She sputtered, fumed, pointed, and finally left, but only after backing up her SUV with a melodramatic screech, and then parking it half in the ditch, its rear tires hugging the edge of my gravel drive. Her son stood awkwardly by the hood, looking less like a birthday boy and more like someone realizing the clown isn't coming after all. I assumed they were retreating, regrouping, maybe even coming to their senses. Instead, she drove off in another vehicle, left her precious SUV behind, and decided to escalate with a call to someone she referred to as my cousin, the councilman. Meanwhile, I sat on my porch with a fresh lemonade and dialed the sheriff, explaining the situation with just enough flavor that even he chuckled and said, "Oh, Lord, not her again." Apparently, I wasn't the first to meet Karen on the wrong end of a property dispute, but I was going to be the last to tolerate it. As the sun began to set and the lake shimmered with gold and pink like it was putting on a play just for me, I took a walk down my boundary lines, checking the survey pins, admiring the fresh weld on my gate, and wondering how a peaceful life could be so hilariously upended by a woman who looked like she brought drama as a +1 to every social function. The real twist didn't come until I rounded the bend behind my workshop and noticed something odd. Tire marks deeper into my land, fresh footprints near the oak tree, and candy wrappers leading toward the shore. They'd been here before, recently, maybe even yesterday. And suddenly, it hit me. This wasn't about a party. This was about taking the cabin back, not in theory, but in secret, like squatting, like entitlement with an agenda. I went back to the house, reviewed the security camera footage, and sure enough, there she was. 2 nights ago, Karen dressed in workout gear, walking around the cabin perimeter with her phone up like she was documenting her kingdom. That's when the plan changed. I wasn't just going to block them. I was going to fence them in, fence them out, and fenced them so hard their GPS would think they were inside a private zoo enclosure. As I stared at her car, still parked in the easement, I got the idea that would spark a level of petty perfection even I didn't know I was capable of. I called my contractor friend at 8:13 p.m. and asked him how fast he could build a fully legal, fully permitted, and extremely obvious fence, one that curved beautifully around a certain vehicle like a velvet rope around a celebrity meltdown. He paused, then said, "If you want it poetic, I'll have my welders there by morning." I hung up, smiling. Karen's son wanted a party. He was about to get one. Only it wouldn't be the kind with music and cake. It would be the kind with fences, lawsuits, and sheriff's reports, and the opening act had just begun. The next morning, I woke up before dawn to the sound of my rooster crowing, which wasn't unusual, except I didn't own a rooster. I pulled on a flannel shirt, poured a splash of lukewarm coffee, and opened the front door to see a small crowd gathered at the edge of my property. Karen, her son, a man in a suit holding a briefcase, and someone filming with a smartphone like this was the opening shot of a reality show nobody asked for. I stepped off the porch slowly, my boots crunching on the gravel. As I approached the gate, which I had double-locked the night before, and called out with polite calm, asking what exactly they thought they were doing trespassing again this early. Karen stepped forward with a smirk that told me she thought she'd won something overnight. The man in the suit introduced himself as her lawyer and said they were here to inform me that I was illegally occupying her property. I almost laughed, but chose not to give him the satisfaction. Instead, I calmly asked him what documents he had that supported such a claim. And with the pride of a magician about to reveal a dove, he pulled out a photocopied page with blurred handwriting and a crooked notary stamp that looked like it had been printed off a dial-up internet connection. I took it from him, scanned it, then without a word reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a pristine county stamp signed and sealed property deed along with a laminated survey map with GPS coordinate. I didn't hand it to him. I held it up like a winning poker hand, and said slowly and clearly that this land, cabin, gate, and even the gravel under their feet were legally mine, purchased in full 3 years ago when Karen's ex-husband's estate went into liquidation. I even pointed to the property lines clearly marked by the steel survey pins they were practically standing on. Her lawyer took a closer look and I saw the twitch in his eyebrow that told me he already knew this wasn't going to end in her favor. Karen, of course, didn't back down. She launched into a speech about emotional ownership, about how memories and traditions override paperwork, how the cabin was in her heart and thus should be in her hands. I didn't say a word while she spiraled. I let her talk herself into circles, then pulled out a small remote, pressed the button, and locked the gate's electric deadbolt with a satisfying click. That's when the sheriff pulled up. I had called him again, this time not for defense, but for documentation. He stepped out of the cruiser, tipped his hat to me, then turned to Karen and said with the tiredness of a man who's seen one too many reruns of the same bad show, "Ma'am, we've been through this already. This land is his. I've seen the papers. If you continue to show up without invitation, it'll be criminal trespass." Karen's son mumbled something under his breath and stomped his foot like a spoiled toddler in a failed Broadway audition. Then, as if the scene wasn't absurd enough, another vehicle arrived. This time, a pickup truck towing a flatbed trailer with what looked like a stage setup. Speakers, lights, even a smoke machine. Her son had actually gone ahead and hired a party crew. They looked confused as they pulled up to the gate and realized there was no access. Karen waved them down and started shouting instructions like she was directing a battlefield maneuver, but the sheriff walked over and gave the driver a look that said, "Turn around or get comfortable in a holding cell." They left. She didn't. She instead pivoted to Plan B, which apparently meant trying to win me over through charm. Her voice softened. She complimented my property, even made a joke about how men in flannel were her weakness. I nearly gagged on my coffee. I told her that charm was as ineffective as threats, and that her continued presence here was now being recorded for court. She scoffed, said something about bringing this to city council, and stormed off toward her SUV, which notably still sat half-parked on my land. I followed slowly, camera in hand, documenting the exact location of her tires and the proximity to my fence line, just in case. And that's when I remembered something important. 2 weeks ago, my neighbor Frank told me he'd seen strangers wandering down by the lower bluff behind the cabin, taking photos and measuring things. He assumed they were surveyors, maybe mine. I had shrugged it off, but now standing here watching Karen yank open her car door, it clicked. She hadn't just been preparing a surprise party. She had been quietly trying to document my land, to take some sort of claim, maybe to argue adverse possession or easement rights that would explain the half-baked deed, the fake notary, the sudden lawyer, the media theatrics. She thought if she could build a case based on presence, on emotional ties and blurry maps, she could muscle her way back into ownership through legal manipulation. But what she didn't know was that I had every inch of this land secured. Not just on paper, but in video, timestamped, GPS logged, and reviewed by the county. When I upgraded the cabin utilities last year, I decided it was time to show my cards. I invited the sheriff and her lawyer to follow me to the workshop where I pulled out a binder nearly 3 in thick, full of title history, court filings from her divorce, land surveys, permit approvals, and even receipts for every upgrade done to the land since I bought it. Her lawyer flipped through it and didn't say a word. Not one. Just closed the binder, handed it back to me, and turned to Karen with the same look a dentist gives someone who hasn't flossed since the Bush administration. He said he'd be withdrawing from further involvement unless new information surfaced. She went pale. She tried to whisper something to him, but he was already walking away. The sheriff gave her one last warning, told her the next call would result in charges, and got back in his cruiser. I stood there watching her try to think her way out of a corner with no doors. Finally, she got in her SUV and peeled off, but not before spinning her tires in a fit of rage and kicking up a wave of gravel that pinged off my fence like applause. That evening, as I sat on my porch with a new cup of coffee, I saw a notification on my phone. Security footage had caught someone sneaking through the tree line at the rear boundary. It was blurry, but it was her son. He was scouting again, maybe hoping to find an opening in the fence line or some weak spot in the property's armor. I shook my head and made another call, not to the sheriff this time, but to my contractor. I told him it was time to move up the fencing job. I wanted every square foot sealed, every angle protected, every loophole closed. I wasn't just defending my cabin anymore. I was drawing the line, literally and legally, between people who earned their peace and those who thought they could steal it back with charm, tantrums, or twisted logic. Tomorrow, the welders would arrive, and by the end of the week, Karen would have more than regrets to deal with. She'd have a fence so beautifully placed, so poetically wrapped around her own bad choices, that even the birds would stop to admire it. The welders showed up just after sunrise. Their truck grumbling down the dirt road like a war drum, hauling panels of custom steel fencing that gleamed in the morning light like a warning to anyone still dreaming of entitlement. I greeted them at the gate, handed them fresh coffee from a thermos, and walked them around the perimeter of the property like a general planning a siege. Only this time, the fortress wasn't under attack. It was the attack. My instructions were simple. No trespassing signs on every panel. The fence line perfectly flush to the survey pins and an artful curved enclosure around the spot where Karen had left her precious SUV half straddling my gravel. I didn't want them to touch the vehicle just to build gracefully around it, leaving a tasteful 4 in of clearance that would ensure the car stayed trapped inside without even scratching the paint. One of the welders chuckled and asked if I wanted a plaque on the fence naming it after her. I grinned but said no. Let her name echo only in karma, not metal. Within an hour, the first posts were going in, and the sound of drilling and clanking rang across the lake like church bells calling petty neighbors to prayer. I stayed nearby, documenting everything, making sure every angle was legal, every bolt permitted, every crew member licensed and sober. I knew Karen would be back. I just didn't know when or how dramatic her entrance would be. But I didn't have to wait long. Just before noon, as the fence was halfway complete, her SUV came screaming down the road again. This time without her son, but with a different flavor of fury. She parked at the same angle, as if reliving her previous act, but now stepped out in gym clothes and oversized sunglasses that made her look like an influencer on a bad Wi-Fi signal. She marched right up to the worksite and started yelling over the sound of the drills, shouting phrases like unlawful construction, community board approval, and violation of her comfort rights, which wasn't a legal phrase, but certainly sounded impressive to someone who gets their legal advice from daytime TV. The lead welder paused, looked at me, then at her, then went right back to work. Karen stormed toward me like a small tornado dressed in discount designer and demanded that I stop the build immediately. I replied that she was currently standing on land owned by me, surveyed by the county and blessed by the sheriff, and that if she wanted to yell, she could do so from the public road which began 20 foot behind her. That's when she crossed the final line. She pulled out her phone and started live streaming, narrating to an invisible audience about how her childhood vacation home was being stolen by a maniac, how her family legacy was under siege, and how the law would be on her side once she exposed my fence cult to the world. I didn't interrupt. I let her rant, pacing in a tight circle like a sitcom villain unraveling in a one-camera setup, while behind her the welders methodically sealed her car inside a perimeter of gleaming metal. When she finally turned around and saw it, her breath caught. There it was, her own vehicle fenced in like a prize pig at a county fair, trapped by nothing but geometry and timing. She screamed. Not just a yell, not a frustrated groan, an actual primal scream that echoed through the trees and startled a flock of birds into the sky. She rushed at the fence, grabbed the bars, and started shaking them like a movie prisoner. I calmly walked over, phone in hand, documenting every moment. I told her the car wasn't touched, the fence was built exclusively on my land, and that if she wanted her car out, she could ask permission. She snarled something unintelligible and declared this was a kidnapping. I blinked, looked at the car, then at her, and asked, "Who exactly did I kidnap, ma'am?" "Your parking spot." That's when the deputy sheriff pulled up again. He stepped out, removed his sunglasses slowly, and said, "You again." Karen spun around and launched into another frantic story. This time adding that I had created a danger zone, that her car was a hostage, and that she feared for her life. The deputy listened politely, then walked over to inspect the fence, the placement of the posts, the position of her vehicle, and the paperwork I handed him, which included permits, photographs, and boundary confirmations. He took it all in, then turned to her and said, "Ma'am, the fence is on his property. Your car is the one trespassing. If you want it out, you'll need his permission or a tow truck, but this is private land now, just like it was last week and last year." She sputtered again, cursed at the welders, then stormed off back to the road where she began making a flurry of phone calls, pacing like a business executive whose company just realized they had no product. I watched her for a moment, then returned to the porch, poured another cup of coffee, and sat in my rocking chair as the fence slowly closed in around the last corner. By mid-afternoon, the job was done. My property was now sealed tighter than a vault, with one exception, the open circle around her car, which now looked like a modern art installation titled Consequences. The welders packed up, took their final photos, shook my hand, and left with grins. I stood at the gate, staring at the sun as it dropped lower, wondering how many more surprises Karen had up her sleeve. But even then, even with the fence complete, I knew the story wasn't over. Because people like her don't just walk away. They escalate. They spin. They dig deeper holes and then blame the world when they can't climb out. Sure enough, at sundown, I received a notice on my phone. Karen had filed a formal complaint with the HOA claiming I had violated community guidelines with unauthorized construction. The kicker, I wasn't even in her HOA. My land sat 200 foot outside their jurisdiction, and her complaint wasn't just frivolous. It was laughably uninformed. Still, I printed it out, stapled it to a corkboard I kept in the cabin, and labeled the section chapter 1 of her undoing. That night, as crickets chirped and moonlight spilled across the lake, I walked the perimeter with a flashlight, admiring the welds, the strength of the gate, the reflection of the panels. I stopped by her car, now silent inside its steel cradle, and couldn't help but mutter a quiet thank you to the universe for delivering such poetic material to my doorstep. I didn't know what Karen would do next, whether she'd lawyer up, rage post, or send in her son for round 2. But whatever it was, I was ready. Because when you try to steal peace from a man who earned it, the least you can expect in return is a fence with your name written in the bolt. The morning after the fence went up around her SUV, I woke to the sound of pounding fists on metal, the kind of sound you'd expect during a prison riot or a demolition gone wrong. But it was just Karen back at it before 8 a.m. slamming both hands against the newly installed panels like she thought sheer volume might reverse legal ownership. She was red in the face, hair disheveled, barefoot this time, as if the performance required a touch of desperation to sell whatever story she had concocted for herself in the mirror before driving down again. I didn't even flinch. I sipped my coffee on the porch, same chair, same view, watching her tantrum as the sun rose behind her, casting long shadows across the gravel where her SUV still sat, imprisoned not by force, but by sheer poetic justice. After a few minutes, she switched tactics. She pulled out her phone again and started filming, panning from her car to the fence to my house, narrating in a trembling voice that I was holding her property hostage, that she feared for her safety and that she was demanding police intervention for this act of aggression. I waved politely at her camera and called the sheriff again, my tone friendly and calm as I explained that I had a very loud guest trespassing once more and that she seemed to be confusing my property for a public theater. The deputy was dispatched immediately and I made sure to unlock the gate before he arrived just to show I wasn't obstructing anything but nonsense. When he pulled up and stepped out, he didn't even look surprised anymore, just tired. He nodded at me, then turned to Karen and listened to her for a solid 3 minutes while she repeated the same narrative she'd been rehearsing all week. Her eyes teared up on command, her voice cracked at all the right moments, and she even pulled out a photo of herself and her son from years ago at the cabin, trying to establish a legacy claim based entirely on nostalgia. The deputy listened, let her finish, then asked her one simple question. "Do you have the title to this property?" Her expression flickered. "Well, no," she said, "but I've been coming here since my son was in diapers." "My ex-husband," the deputy cut her off. "Already done." "Ma'am, emotional history is not legal ownership. This man has the deed. The fence is on his land. Your car is not. You need to stop coming here." But Karen, being Karen, couldn't take no for an answer. She pivoted, insisted that my fencing her car was a violation of her rights, that I had damaged her vehicle, that I was provoking her emotionally, and that she was considering pressing charges for unlawful detainment. The deputy sighed deeply, walked over to the fence, and examined every inch of it, taking photos himself. He inspected the spacing, the fact that not 1 inch of metal touched her car, and then turned to me and asked if I had any footage of the installation. I handed him a flash drive with time-stamped clips from 4 different angles. He reviewed one quickly on his tablet, then nodded, satisfied. "You did everything by the book," he said. "You even gave her room to move it before the fence was finished." Then he looked back at her. "Your car is on his property. You left it here. That's on you. If you want it back, you'll need his permission or a tow service that can fit through this gate, assuming he lets them in." Karen exploded. "This is harassment. You're just taking his side because he probably pays you off. This is abuse. My son's emotional well-being is at stake." At that exact moment, almost as if summoned by the universe to add irony, her son pulled up in another vehicle, loud music thumping from the stereo, 3 friends in the back seat and a cooler in the trunk. He stepped out clearly having no idea what chaos he was walking into until he saw his mom screaming at a sheriff and a car fenced in like an exhibit. Mom," he said, baffled. "What the hell happened to your car?" She turned and snapped at him to shut up, which did not go over well. One of his friends laughed. I recognized the kid from the first party attempt. Apparently, they were still clinging to the fantasy that the cabin could be theirs for a weekend rave. The deputy looked at me and quietly asked, "Do you want her cited for trespassing again?" I thought about it for a moment. I looked at her, still flailing, still screaming, still trying to bend the universe to her will, and I nodded. "Yes," I said. "This is the 4th time. Enough's enough." He issued her a citation on the spot. She ripped it in half and tossed it on the ground, which only earned her another fine for littering. Her son's friends were now filming the entire meltdown, which seemed to annoy her even more, and in a final act of defiance, she sat down in the gravel next to the fence and began chanting that she was being imprisoned, refusing to move until justice was served. I offered her a bottle of water. She knocked it away. The deputy told me not to engage further and that they'd handle it from here. Eventually, she left again, this time dragged away by her own son, who clearly had lost whatever patience he had left. But the day wasn't done. An hour later, a different car arrived. A man in a suit stepped out, clearly not the same lawyer from before, and introduced himself as a community mediator. Someone Karen had apparently called to negotiate terms of shared use. I nearly burst out laughing, but held my composure. I invited him in, served him coffee on the porch, and listened to his proposal, which boiled down to this: allow Karen and her son limited weekend access to the property for emotional closure, and in exchange, she would drop any formal complaints. I smiled, sipped my coffee, and said, here's my counterproposal. She never steps foot on my land again, or I press charges for trespassing and harassment. Deal? He stared at me, nodded, and left. No compromise, no closure, just facts. The next day, I made one more call to a local metal sculptor who specialized in decorative signage. I commissioned a custom sign for the fence section surrounding Karen's SUV. The sign would read, "Legacy parking reserved for entitled guests." Below it, in smaller print, "This art installation brought to you by the letter L." When the sign was mounted the following afternoon, several neighbors showed up just to take selfies with it. Apparently, word had spread. Karen's meltdown had become neighborhood legend. People who had lived quietly under her tyranny for years were now emboldened, sharing their own stories of property line disputes, noise complaints, and backyard surveillance. Her reputation was no longer just whispered. It was trending. By sunset, I received a polite email from the HOA president asking if I'd be willing to attend their next meeting. I wasn't even in the HOA, but it seemed even they were looking for someone to bring a little order to the circus, and I had just the popcorn for it. 2 days after the citation and the decorative sign installation, I figured the storm had finally passed. That maybe even someone like Karen had a limit to how many times she could throw herself against the immovable wall of law and reality before realizing the only thing bruising was her ego. I was wrong. Just as I was fixing a loose hinge on my workshop door and enjoying the quiet, the kind of silence that only follows chaos when it finally runs out of fuel, I heard the unmistakable thump of bass rolling down the gravel road. I turned my head just in time to see Karen's son's Jeep swing wide into the drive, kicking up a spray of dust as it came to a dramatic halt just shy of the fence. The music was blaring, some kind of distorted club anthem, and out jumped the birthday boy with a six-pack under one arm and a Bluetooth speaker in the other. Behind him, another car rolled in, then a third. Within minutes, I had a half-dozen teenagers and 20-somes laughing and shouting just outside my gate, trying to create a party vibe on a patch of dirt and disappointment. Karen herself was nowhere to be seen, which at first struck me as strange until I realized this was likely her last-ditch play to send in the next generation of entitlement to do what she couldn't. I stepped forward, unlocked the smaller service gate, and walked out to meet them. The moment he saw me, her son stepped up, cocky smirk in place, and said, "You know this is all a joke, right? You can't actually keep us off the lake. There's public access a mile down and we've got kayak, so we'll just float over. You can't stop water." I tilted my head, nodded slowly, and replied, "You're right. I can't stop water, but I can stop trespassing, and filming is legal on my land, so thank you for giving me fresh footage." I held up my phone, already recording. One of the girls behind him tried to play peacemaker, asking if they could just use the lawn for a few hours and promising they'd clean up, but another guy ruined that hope by pulling out a lighter and waving it like he was at a concert. They had no idea how fast things were about to unravel. I told them they had 60 seconds to clear out before I called the sheriff again and that any attempt to cross the fence or dock on my shoreline would be considered trespassing. One of them laughed and said, "What? You going to sick your little sheriff buddy on us again?" As if on cue, a cruiser rolled down the road, almost like it had been waiting in the wings of this sad little play. The deputy stepped out, recognized the group from a previous lake incident involving fireworks and a burned picnic table, and immediately took control. He ordered them to line up, asked for IDs, and when Karen's son refused, he was promptly reminded that refusal could mean detainment. That sobered him up. They handed over their IDs one by one, and while the deputy ran the checks, I casually mentioned to him that one of them had said something about using the public dock to reach my property from the lakeside. He nodded grimly and said he'd make sure patrols were watching the shoreline for the next 48 hours. As he was speaking, his radio chirped and something in his tone changed. He looked at Karen's son and asked him to step aside. Apparently, there was an outstanding warning in the system tied to a firework-related injury last summer, a kid who got burned at a party thrown by this same group. The deputy asked if they had permission to host that event. The answer predictably was no. I stood quietly watching this unfold like a man who planted seeds months ago and was just now seeing the first green shoots of karma. Karen's son started stammering, throwing out excuses, blaming other kids, but the deputy wasn't there for stories. He issued another citation, this time for attempted trespassing and a noise violation, and told them all to clear out. As they scrambled back into their vehicles, one of them shouted something about me being a bitter old man. I smiled and waved. Age had nothing to do with it. I just liked my land quiet. That night, I decided it was time to tie the bow on this gift Karen and her family had unknowingly handed me. I drafted a formal complaint against her for repeated harassment supported by dozens of documented instances, video clips, and witness statements from neighbors. I also added a request for civil damages related to emotional distress, legal fees, and land security enhancements. By morning, the file was thick enough to hand over to my attorney, who chuckled when he saw the compilation and said, "This isn't a complaint. It's a documentary." I told him to go ahead and file. Within 48 hours, Karen was served. And then something strange happened. She disappeared. No SUV at the gate. No screaming matches, no emails, no calls. The lake fell back into silence. For 3 days, I thought she might be licking her wounds, regrouping, or maybe even learning. But on the 4th day, a tow truck arrived. Not sent by her, but by the county. Apparently, after her car had sat unregistered and unmoved on my land for over 2 weeks, it now qualified as an abandoned vehicle under local ordinance. I had filed the necessary paperwork days earlier just in case. The tow operator examined the fence, laughed to himself, then carefully maneuvered through the open panel I had arranged just for him. Within 20 minutes, Karen's precious SUV was gone. In its place, I had the sculptor install a second sign right next to the first. This one read, "Exhibit closed due to owner inactivity." The fence was re-welded by sunset. That same evening, I got a call from the HOA president. Not only was Karen facing formal reprimand for bringing negative attention to the community, but several members had stepped forward with stories of harassment, privacy invasion, and even forged complaints Karen had filed on their behalf without their knowledge. One neighbor had proof she had altered drone photos to falsely accuse someone of building a fire pit. Another revealed Karen had been charging locals to use the scenic area behind the cabin, my land, as a photoshoot backdrop, pocketing the money herself. The community was unraveling her, and I didn't have to lift a finger. My story had become more than a fence around a car. It was now a lesson in what happens when entitlement crashes into paperwork and preparedness. But the best part wasn't the silence or the victory or even the legal filings. It was what arrived the next day in a plain brown envelope. A letter from Karen's lawyer, not the first one, but a new one, requesting a settlement discussion. Apparently, she now wanted to resolve matters amicably. I didn't reply. I folded the letter, tucked it into my corkboard beneath the parking sign, and went back to my porch. Peace doesn't respond to panic. It waits, and it wins. By the time the 6th week of silence rolled around, it was almost suspicious, like the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from the deep inhale before an explosion. And even though I should have been enjoying the uninterrupted mornings on the dock, the absence of chaos from Karen's camp felt more like a setup than a surrender. I kept waiting for a knock at the door, a drone buzzing over my fence, a sudden cease and desist notice nailed to my gate like an amateur horror movie. But nothing came. Instead, one evening, just before dusk, a letter arrived in an envelope so pristine and polite-looking that I almost mistook it for an invitation to a garden party. It was from the county clerk's office notifying me that Karen had filed an appeal against the trespassing charges and included a counterclaim alleging emotional distress, public humiliation, and what she called, without irony, targeted fencing aggression. I read it 3 times just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating, then called my lawyer, who laughed so hard he had to put me on hold. When he returned, he told me not to worry. Her case was thin. The evidence we had was airtight, and he'd already drafted a response that would make a judge roll their eyes so hard they'd see last week. But that wasn't the real surprise. The real surprise came 2 days later at the courthouse, where I appeared with my lawyer for the first mediation hearing. Karen arrived fashionably late, dressed like she was attending a red carpet scandal interview, oversized sunglasses, blazer 2 sizes too dramatic, and a clipboard filled with what I could only assume were screenshots of Facebook posts and real estate listings that she somehow believed strengthened her case. Her son didn't come, nor did any lawyer. She represented herself, which I immediately realized was going to be more entertaining than any daytime television ever could be. The judge entered, glanced through the documents, and then, with the tone of someone already regretting their career choices, asked Karen to explain her counterclaim. What followed was 20 minutes of breathtaking nonsense. She claimed the fence was a weapon, that I had used it to trap and humiliate her, that I had orchestrated a social media smear campaign against her character, and that the signage I installed had triggered decades of emotional trauma connected to fences, confinement, and judgment. She cried. She gestured. She nearly quoted poetry. And then she concluded by saying she would drop everything if I agreed to remove the fence and deed her partial lake access for therapeutic closure. The room fell silent, not out of sympathy, but sheer disbelief. The judge raised an eyebrow, looked at me, then turned back to Karen and asked if she had any documentation proving ownership or right-of-way privileges. She pulled out a single faded photograph of her and her son in front of the cabin from years ago, posed on a porch swing I had replaced the first week I bought the place. The judge looked at it, sighed, and then slowly, meticulously dismantled her argument like a surgeon removing a splinter from a hand that insisted it had been stabbed. He explained property rights, the difference between sentiment and title, and the function of county records. When he was finished, he turned to me and asked if I wished to proceed with the lawsuit I had filed for damages and harassment. I said yes. Karen's mouth dropped open as though the concept of consequence had only now arrived in her vocabulary. She tried to pivot, offering to pay for half the fence if I would consider settlement, but the judge had heard enough. He ordered her countersuit dismissed and gave us a date for the civil hearing. As we walked out of the courtroom, Karen stopped me in the hallway. Her tone was no longer aggressive or dramatic. It was oddly quiet, but laced with venom. She told me I had made a very powerful enemy, that she had friends in city planning, in the press, even in the courthouse, and that this wasn't over. I told her she was right. It wasn't over. Not until she learned the difference between ownership and obsession. I walked away, but I knew with her kind the storm always circled back. And I was right because a week later, the city planning office received a complaint alleging that my cabin violated setback codes, environmental protections, and historical view obstruction. It was an anonymous complaint, but subtlety had never been Karen's forte. I got the notice, chuckled, and then invited the inspector over personally, offering him coffee, a complete tour, and copies of all my permits and architectural approvals. He spent half an hour walking the property, complimented my craftsmanship, and before leaving, handed me a warning about malicious complaints. He said this wasn't the first time someone had tried to weaponize the department against a neighbor. And in his words, we're tracking a pattern. That was when the final piece fell into place. I contacted my lawyer and requested we subpoena any prior complaints Karen had filed over the past 3 years. The results were astonishing. Over 30 documented cases, noise, zoning, permit violations, vegetation overgrowth, even claims about dogs barking too spiritually had been filed under her name or from her email. Most were dismissed. A few had caused headaches for innocent neighbors. But now, with her countersuit rejected and my own suit moving forward, we had enough to demonstrate a pattern of harassment, not just against me, but against the entire community. My lawyer proposed something bold. We would file for a restraining order that not only prevented Karen from setting foot on my land, but included a clause barring her from weaponizing public departments or agencies as a form of retaliation. It was aggressive, yes, but this wasn't petty anymore. This was systemic. I agreed. We filed it. And as the court prepared to review the motion, word spread. Neighbors who had remained quiet before now came forward, offering statements, emails, footage every time Karen had tried to control, report, or manipulate her way into power. A week later, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It wasn't from Karen. It was from the county auction house. Apparently, one of Karen's assets, specifically her luxury convertible, had gone up for auction due to unpaid property taxes, and I had been flagged as a qualified bidder due to prior filings. Out of pure curiosity and a dash of mischief, I attended. The auction was short. The car was in decent condition, and for reasons I didn't question, I won the bid for a fraction of what it was worth. The convertible now sits in my driveway, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. I had it washed, tuned, and registered. And when Karen drove past my property that evening and saw it parked next to the same spot where her SUV had once sat fenced in, she slammed on her brakes so hard the tires screeched. She didn't get out. She didn't say a word. She just stared, then drove off. I don't know what she'll do next. Maybe nothing, maybe everything, but whatever it is, I'll be ready. Not because I enjoy the conflict. Not because I want to win, but because I now understand something that Karen never will. Peace isn't something you demand, hijack, or manipulate into existence. Peace is something you build post by post, permit by permit, with patience, paperwork, and the kind of quiet resolve that no tantrum can dent. And if offense happens to be part of that peace, then so be it. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the lake mist clung gently to the trees, and the only sound was the creak of my porch chair as I leaned back with a steaming cup of black coffee, watching the stillness settle like an old friend returning from war. The storm had passed. Karen had vanished from the property line for almost 3 weeks straight. Not a single visit, not a drone, not even a staged yoga session on the gravel shoulder she once claimed was a historic meditation zone. The court had approved the restraining order with a satisfying lack of ceremony, and the order itself now hung framed inside my workshop wall, directly above a photo I'd taken of her SUV trapped inside the custom steel perimeter. A scene so absurd and yet so perfect that it still made me chuckle when I passed it. The convertible I'd won at auction sat polished and parked in the drive, no longer bait, but simply irony on wheels. The peace felt earned, heavy in its quiet, and for a while I believed the ending had finally arrived. But closure, I would learn, rarely knocks. It sneaks in, dressed like coincidence. That Tuesday, while I was working on a new dock railing, a black sedan pulled up slowly to the edge of my driveway. No music, no dust, just silence and idling. I stopped what I was doing, wiped my hands on a rag, and stepped forward just enough to see who stepped out. It wasn't Karen. It was a woman I didn't recognize. Mid-30s, well-dressed, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. She introduced herself as a county development officer and said she was conducting a follow-up inspection due to a recent inquiry involving land use violations and shoreline disturbances. I blinked once, nodded, and invited her in, already feeling the old tension rising in my spine. She walked the property with polite professionalism, asking questions about when the fence had been installed, who completed the dock work, whether any trees had been removed. I answered every question with precision, handed her copies of permits, contractor receipts, drone footage of the original lot condition, even timestamps from the welder's cameras. After 40 minutes, she snapped her clipboard closed, smiled faintly, and said, "Looks like everything is in perfect order. Honestly, you're one of the few people I've inspected who actually overdocuments." I told her it was a new hobby, courtesy of an enthusiastic neighbor. She smiled wider and said she understood. Then she hesitated. She looked around one more time, glanced over at the property line, and asked if I was aware that someone had recently attempted to file for a shared access easement through my lower trail. I felt my stomach drop just slightly, the way you do when you realize the wind you thought had died down is simply curling around for another pass. I asked her if the request had gone through. She said no. It was denied on the grounds that the applicant had no standing or legal tie to the land, but she also noted that the applicant had tried to argue community tradition and generational passage, two phrases I knew all too well. Karen was still trying, not with drama, not with confrontation, but with quiet paperwork filed from the shadows. After the officer left, I sat for a long while under the oak tree behind the cabin, staring out at the lake and thinking, I had already won. The fence stood. The property was mine. The legal battle had been buried under a mountain of logic and filings, and yet here she was, still tossing pebbles into the machinery, hoping something would jam. I thought about responding, about filing another complaint, maybe adding a clause to the restraining order. But then I remembered something my grandfather once said when I was a boy, sitting on a broken fishing dock, watching mosquitoes bounce over the surface of a muddy creek. He told me, sometimes the best revenge is to outlive the noise. Let it echo. let it burn itself out. You just stay put and keep building. So that's what I did. I built not more fences or gates or walls, but a new deck overlooking the water, wide and peaceful, with benches I carved myself. I built a garden near the path that used to be her shortcut, filled it with herbs and wildflowers, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Private Peace in Progress." I hosted a barbecue for my neighbors, the ones who'd suffered her in silence for years. And for once, laughter rolled across the hill like wind through trees. A few weeks after that, something strange happened. A young couple showed up at the gate, knock on the wood, polite smiles on their faces. They introduced themselves as newlyweds from 2 towns over. Said they'd heard stories about the cabin, about the view, and asked if I ever rented it for quiet getaways. Not parties, not events, just weekends of reading and resting. I looked at them, polite, respectful, earnest. I nodded. For the first time in all this madness, I said yes. A week later, they arrived with a canvas tote full of books, a picnic basket, and 2 mugs that said, "Peace tastes like coffee." They stayed the weekend, left a thank you note folded into the porch rail. It read simply, "Thank you for building something sacred." That was when I realized something beautiful had happened. In defending my land from chaos, I had not just pushed something away. I had created space for something better. The fence hadn't boxed me in. It had filtered the noise. And beyond it, real connection was growing. One night, just before fall turned the trees gold, I saw a car parked far down the road, too far to see clearly, but familiar enough in posture to make me pause. It didn't approach. It didn't linger long. Just sat there for a while, headlights off, engine purring, watching. Maybe Karen, maybe someone else. I didn't go down to check. I didn't wave. I just turned and walked back inside, poured myself a glass of lemonade, and sat down with my feet up, the house humming with the silence I had earned, one sleepless battle at a time. And as I sat there, I smiled. Because for the first time in months, I no longer feared the next knock. I no longer watched the tree line for shadows or worried about traps disguised as city mail. I had lived through the storm. I had turned a fight into foundation, a fence into freedom. And if Karen ever came back, if she ever decided to try again with new papers, new plans, new stories, she'd find the same man sitting in the same chair backed by law, land, and laughter. And no matter what storm she brought, I wouldn't flinch. Because peace, once built right, doesn't need to raise its voice. It just sits still, lets the wind blow, and waits for noise to trip over its own echo.